folks. I suppose, like Henry, I've been looking at and interested in alternative methods of training since the mid-1980s, probably 1 or 2 years after Henry started looking at it. Why I was interested in it in the first place? Well, the situation I found myself in 1986 was I was out running from university, Glasgow University, and I became entangled in a motorbike. Basically, a motorbike lost control, careened across the road, and the pedal slid right through my leg. So I found myself with a major injury to my left lower leg, compound fracture, tib, and facing a long time on the sidelines. To boot, it was just before the track season, Commonwealth Games, etc., etc. So at the time I started thinking, well, I have to look at some alternative way of keeping fit. And essentially my interest in water running stems from my need to try and find a way of maintaining fitness during a prolonged period out while I was undergoing several operations in order to get back to where I was before. So essentially, long-term recovery from major injury was the key aspect for me. As we all know, I think after about 2 or 3 weeks of a layoff, you lose quite dramatically cardiovascular fitness. But quite a few studies have shown that there are ways to actually maintain that fitness via alternative methods of training. And obviously water running is one of the things that has been shown to have that effect. I did a wee bit of research in the mid-80s, probably stumbled upon some of the same literature that you had looked at, Henry, particularly around the people who were at that point were starting to market the wet vest, and particularly what caught my eye was around the experience of Roberto Salazar, who had major injury problems quite a few weeks before one of his major city marathons, and had to use an alternative method of training for the final 6 to 8 weeks before that, and had produced some very good results. So, from that I then sent away and received a wet vest in the mid-80s, and really have used water running training ever since. Probably my approach is more the kind of classical deep water running approach that you probably started with, Henry, and then obviously evolved into something more specifically. Although what I think is interesting about Henry's approach is one of the key things I'm going to talk about later is that I think one of the secrets of success in the context of water running is variety. And actually I'm quite interested to learn what you've got, because one of the challenges with water running is that it can be quite monotonous, and one of the ways to overcome that is to have a degree of variety. Variety combined with intensity, to me, are the two key words in the context of water running. So really since the mid-80s, first of all, for between 86 and 89, when I went through a number of operations culminating in a bone graft operation in the summer of 88, I have used deep water running as recovery from injury, and then eventually evolved into something a bit more complementary. I now actually use it now at the grand old age of 46. I now use it and have been for the last maybe 10 years as an alternative to a road interval session that I have, and therefore only do one major session during the week. And overall, and over my running career, and I've been fortunate to be able to run for the UK on the road, and the hills, and the cross country, and on the track. And throughout all that period, I have incorporated water running or training within my own schedule. And I would say it's one of the two main cross training activities that I think are particularly effective. The other one, and this is obviously very specific to myself as a longer distance athlete as opposed to Guy and maybe more of the power-based athletes, but to me, water running and uphill bike sessions are the two key cross-training activities. And if you can't run, you're not able to run, and you can incorporate one of these two types of cross-training activities into your schedule, then you can maintain fitness. In some aspects you can enhance conditioning as well, but you can certainly maintain fitness and therefore reduce the impact of your day off. This wee slide, I just put this up just to show you where I was in 1987, I think. Bobby gets back into the swing of things. That's a little article from Scotland's Runner in 1987. Was taken just in the period when I was getting to grips with the fact I was going to be out for a while, and I had to do something else to retain fitness, to retain interest, to ensure that I managed to de-stress and all the other things associated with the the injured athlete. So it's a wee article there. If anyone's, there's actually a website, Sal Road Running Commission website, that's now got the PDF of all Scotland's runners, every single one of them. So if you want to actually read the specific details, you can then have a quick look at them. A couple of quotes there. Training water is actually harder than running, and there's something about getting my pulse rate up to over 200 as part of the process. So that's interesting. So that's where I was. This is the slide that I used when we did the Edinburgh session. This was taken from this. This was the base routine that I really built my training philosophy and built my own approach to training throughout. Obviously there'll be morning 4 or 5 mile run, but in terms of my afternoon main sessions, this is the base routine that I then adapt for track, adapt for hills, adapt for cross country. Just to show you where I've squeezed in terms of complementary training, where I've squeezed in some water running as well. So normally I did a road interval session on a Monday, and then I would do a faster tempo run on a Tuesday. The way circumstances worked out, I suppose for Henry's circumstances it worked out because he's got a pool, and the pool's got specific configuration and he's maximised that. For me, I used to do a little run, 5 to 8 miles. It finished with about a mile uphill, and at the top of the hill was a leisure centre. And in the leisure centre there was a swimming pool. So I used to finish my run, jump into the swimming pool before I cooled down, do 8 times a minute with a minute recovery, fairly high intensity. I'd done an interval session the day before, fairly high intensity, but remember there's no impact. And then my wife would pick me up. So all these circumstances fell into place to allow me to incorporate a bit of water running within my normal schedule. Latterly, over the last 10 years, with old age, I've not been able to follow that base routine, and I have replaced the road interval session with a pool session. I'll give you the specific details of that pool session later, but and actually I've still managed to, at that point, still run relatively well within that context. Okay, so what are the benefits of water running? And a lot of this kind of reinforces what Henry's also said, but I suppose more specifically about deep water running, which is, as I say, the kind of background that I came from. First of all, the key thing about water running is it can maintain fitness when you can't run. And when you can't run at all, and you really have major problems with any kind of weight-bearing issues, i.e. have a broken leg, governed from a broken leg. So. And I think some of the exercises that you said would have been very complimentary to me, Henry, but I think at some point during my recovery I still wouldn't have been able to do some of the things, because although I have noticed that you've talked about adapting, with Steph 12 you've adapted things to take into account the fact that maybe ankle wasn't strong enough yet to jump in or out of the pool, so you certainly can do that. But certainly deep water running, you can maintain fitness when you can't run. There's a number of studies have taken place, mainly in America. Florida State University, Brigham Young, a cross-country runner called Ed Eyestone did some work on it as well, and a few other studies that have shown that when they've looked at groups of runners doing water-based deep water running compared with a control group doing normal running, and then measuring their performance over 5k, 2k, or scientifically looking at a VO2 max and lactic threshold tolerance, they've actually not found significant difference between the two groups, and that suggests that it is possible to maintain fitness when you can't run. However, it's not an automatic assumption. There are certain things you have to do when tackling a pool-related programme, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's not just a case of thinking, that's okay, I'm injured, don't worry, I'll do some water running and I'll be as good as ever. That's not the answer. There's some things we still have to look at. It is very much a time-efficient method of cross-training. Cycling, you have to cycle for hours to get the same impact, particularly on the flat. That's why I like to do hill reps on the bike, because I can do it very quickly. As someone that's got a wife and kids and other commitments, time efficiency is important to me. But deep water running is near to normal running as you can get. Obviously, the main constraint is a pool. You need a swimming pool. And even if you don't have the luxury of the kind of configuration that Henry's got, to me a pool with a reasonable sized deep end is really what you need. It's a resistance workout, but it's also running specific. So obviously you're running against there's a resistance against the water, but it's as running specific as you can get. It's certainly more running specific than any other form of cross training. So you're still just psychologically and physically rehearsing the running action and the running effect and impact that you have. But it is by its very nature, even deep water running, I think Henry's programme even more so, but even deep water running for somebody like me, who's not particularly into circuits and weights, it does provide some degree of workout to the upper body. One sort of version I do is the normal hand clench sort of, fist, loosely held fist scenario. Change that to the karate chop approach, and you get a real effect on your upper body. It develops your mental strength. It's hard work, water running. It's not the most exciting thing to do. You have to be very motivated. And when you're faced with a few weeks on the sidelines, and you can come through at the other end, you do get a sense of mental strength and satisfaction coming out the other end, running well, and thinking, look what I've done while I've been off. So I think that's important. As I said back in Edinburgh, I do think the mental side of running is as if not more important than the physical side. I suppose the last point is when you move from the rehabilitation to the complementary side of it, that you can obviously increase your training without training volume without injury. So I have seen the benefits. Henry's seen the benefits of using water-based training, irrespective of whether you're injured or not, and trying to incorporate it into your existing schedules. Okay, so what are some of the issues we need to consider in the context of water running? Some of these we might have some disagreements or agreements in terms of our relative approach. I suppose the first thing is technique, and tied with the second point, belt up or not. For me, I think that there's not a lot of literature on water running and the benefits of deep water running. There's a few, but there's a wee bit of debate about technique. I personally think we over-focus on the technique, and that's, some people want to get a classic running style technique. But to me, as long as your back is straight, you're leaning very slightly forward, and you're sort of replicating the running action, and you feel as if you're replicating the running action within yourself, I don't worry too much about technique. Some people move through the water a bit more quickly than others. It's not a race. It doesn't relate to the amount of effort. It usually relates to the type of technique that you've got. But I think, for me personally, it's about finding your own technique, finding a technique that you're comfortable with, and then executing it in the context of intense sessions. To belt up or not, I started off using the wet vest, as you can see from that earlier article. Henry obviously talked about the wet vest. There's a number of other flotation devices that people have used. I personally have found more intense sessions and closer heart rates to what I would get on dry land when I've not used the belt. However, one of the dangers of not using the belt is that potentially you might sacrifice a bit of technique, and you might end up doggy paddling a little bit, moving too far forward, or too much of a cycling action, etc., etc. I don't worry too much about these things, but as long as I bear in mind a kind of basic technique, I personally prefer not to use a belt now. It also allows me to do one or two other things that help with the variety and intensity of approach that I'll talk about in a second, that are maybe constrained with the belt. So, in summary, I don't use the belt. My technique is maybe not perfect, but it suits me and I know it gets me results. So, that's really the bottom line. In terms of my training, my initial approach, and its approach probably similar today, is to convert distance to time. So essentially, when in the 80s, when I was completely out, I would do a kind of 5k type track session in the pool, and then I would do a 1500 pace type track session in the pool. If I was doing thousands, I'll convert it to 3 minutes. If I was doing 400s, I'll convert it to minutes. Sort of rough rule of thumb, conversion distance to time. I think with aerobic type 5 to 10k type sessions, one of the key things you have to do is shorten the recovery. You are actually, your heart rate, because of the water temperature, usually it's harder to get your heart rate up. So therefore, I think there's a perceived intensity to a session. You actually have to work harder to do the same thing in the pool, and one of the ways to do that is to have shorter recoveries. But you can't sacrifice intensity with shorter recoveries, so you still have the same intensity of effort, but you just take, So at the moment, I'll do a session on a Monday or a Tuesday night where I do 4 times 3 minutes in the pool, and I only take 20 seconds to 30 seconds recovery between these reps, and then I'll do another type of rep immediately following on to that, which I'll go on to talk about in a second, but again with a fairly short recovery. When I do the kind of 1500 type sessions, I tend not to necessarily shorten the recovery, the lactic buffering type sessions, so maybe 4 to 8 times a minute with a minute off, really intense sessions. Then I would tend to keep with, for me, that it's been most effective when I've kept to the same recovery as before. I do think it's really, it is hard mentally, so therefore you have to focus on variety. There are some athletes that can jump in a pool and do a Sunday run in a pool, but there are very, very few. You know, they can run in a pool continuously for 2 hours. Well, I think we can run the pool continuously for 2 hours, but our minds can wander to a range of other things, and therefore we'll lose that last point in red, which is a key thing I would emphasise about. It's all about intensity. If you drop the intensity of pool running, you will lose your fitness. It's not a case of just replicating your running sessions in the pool. You have to up the intensity. You have to feel, you're not really, but you have to feel as if you're working harder. Your heart rate indicates that you're not working harder, but you have to feel as if you're working harder. So for it to be effective, you have to go into it with the impact that every session you do has a degree of intensity. So even for steady runs, you maybe have to do things like hard for 5 minutes, easy for 5 minutes. You have to use a number of mental techniques to retain intensity. And that's, I suppose, one of the beauties of your approach, Henry, that you've got variety. You know, one of the challenges with deep water running is you're more limited in terms of the variety. It's more running specific, I would argue, but you know, than some of the other things that Henry's talking about. But the challenge is that it's harder to get variety, and indeed it's easy to let the intensity slip. You know, so and that's why I do more sessions and lots of sessions. There's a guy called Pete Fitzinger, distance runner, American distance runner. He's got a website, pfitzinger.com. It's got a 9-week schedule for someone up with a stress fracture of deep water interval sessions, and the focus is on intensity. There's not so much steady running. There's more focus on interval sessions. At the end of the day, you know, you're not impacting on the ground, so you can do more interval sessions. You can do more intense stuff. Okay, to finish off, what's my most effective session? Well, for me, I think in order to achieve variety, intensity, in order to some degree, to feel as if I worked really hard. The most effective session I've found over the years, and it's something that I don't use the belt for, is to combine, and I'm not a great swimmer, but to combine underwater swimming with deep water running. I do a typical session, and I've done it with Scott and with Ross Toole, and I think they would agree it can get quite intense sometimes. I've done a session with them where we, well, one variant is I do 4 times 3 minutes with 20 to 30 seconds recovery. And then straight into 4 times swimming a breadth of a 25 metre pool. I think it's 12.5 metre breadth, you know, it's like kind of a classic shape. Yeah. Either that, or I do maybe 13 strokes, half a pool, if the deep end's enough going down the way. I do half a length of a classic pool, underwater, surface, run very slowly back to the other side, okay, and then immediately do another half a length underwater, and then run back again, and then take 20 to 30 seconds and do that 4 times. I've done that 8 times right the way through, so replaced that with the initial 4 times 3 minutes, but it's quite intense. I've also done that session where I've done a half a length underwater, half a length running back, and then taking the recovery. But I think over the years I've developed that where I do that twice without the recovery, and then take a short recovery. Again, it's that key point about intensity. And other guys from Cobarkin have done that, and have actually had quite remarkable results, similar to what